G'day and welcome back to Spectator Australia TV and CounterCulture, where the Spectator Australia and the Institute of Public Affairs join forces to help you make sense of the smoking garbage fire that is sadly the 21st century. Well, it's been another crazy week. Joining us this week is Spectator Australia regular, future Prime Minister, we hope, and yes, we have to move him downstairs first, Senator Matt Canavan, talking about the New South Wales floods and why green ideology will put more lives in harm's way. Kerry Wakefield talks common sense on the all-consuming national debate about toxic masculinity. Morgan Begg explains why the Morrison government only has itself to blame for the Christian Porter affair. And as always, we have Rowan Dean telling us why quotas aren't the answer, and Sarah Dudley reflecting on ScoMo's Sea of Tears. So let's get into it. You know how things were better when you were a kid? Music, movies, the value of fiat currency. The further I get into my 30s, the more I find myself uttering that awful phrase, back in my day. And lately, one thing I've been particularly nostalgic about is politics. Politics back in my day. You see, I joined the Liberal Party on my 16th birthday for my sins. The year was 2003 and things were just different then. Not just because we had, those great old bulls like John Howard and Peter Costello and Alexander Downer. Politics itself was different. It was still rough and tumble, it was still hard-nosed, it was still full-on, as it absolutely should be in any democratic society. But we argued over public policy, issues that actually affected people who voted our politicians in. Remember when we used to debate industrial relations? Really debate it as a matter of policy. Yeah, work choices was a dud policy and terrible politics, but we had the debate and the Australian people had their say. Compare that with the industrial relations bill that went down in the Senate last week. It was actually a pretty big deal. It would have affected millions of Australian workers whose wages are flatlining and thousands of Australian businesses who are struggling to hire. But did you even know that it was being debated? I barely noticed, and I do this for a living. The only time I really heard about the bill at all was from that bus ad that the unions have been running around the clock. And again, I make the point. We don't talk about policy anymore, largely, I guess, because there's no actual policy to talk about. Just globs of obscene spending and cheap money with nothing to show for it except extortionate asset prices and a debt that will never, ever be paid off. Meanwhile, we've become obsessed with scandals, gossip, tawdry, lowest common denominator trash that makes the old Jerry Springer show look like a sophisticated debating society. And this week was dominated by more sleaze, more muck and more filth. And yeah, look, the behaviour alleged is disgraceful and it's wrong. But if we're going to get angry about, politicians, for example, screwing prostitutes in the dark corners of Parliament House, can we at least get equally as angry about them screwing generations of Australian taxpayers in the chamber and then bragging about it at a press conference? Because right now, what amounts to public policy reminds me of former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's warning in 1980 that Australia would eventually become the poor white trash of Asia. If we don't get serious about the problems facing this country, he'll be proven right 40 years later. But anyway, what do you think? What should be our real priorities in Australia? What should we be focusing on? Leave a comment down below because unlike our political class, you know as well as I do that what we're doing isn't working. Now, if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to this channel, Spectator Australia TV, and please give this video a like by clicking the buttons down below. As I say every week, the YouTube algorithm doesn't like conservative content, but we are beating that algorithm thanks to your liking, your subscribing, and your sharing. Keep going, keep clicking, because we have to get the message out, because it's a great message and one that every Australian needs to hear, as I'm sure you'll agree. So joining me as always to talk about what the message is our Editor-in-Chief, Rowan Dean. Rowan, how are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you going, Gideon?
I am very, very well, despite it being a circus of a week in our nation's capital. And on that, you've written a really, really brave, I must say, editorial in the current cancel culture environment, but a thoroughly accurate one as always. And you basically said that in relation to all this scandal, all this business that's happening in Parliament, we're essentially misdiagnosing the problem and we're offering up, meaningless, worthless solutions. Can you talk us through a little bit about that?
The big one, of course, the one which drove this whole agenda was the revelations. We don't know how true or accurate they are, but there does appear to be some kind of backup footage to support the claims made on Channel 10 and in the Australian about sexual acts on a desk, but most importantly, sexual acts between consenting males within Parliament House, which were filmed, which took place in a minister's office, some solo acts. I assume that a solo act, by definition, you have consent for, but other acts, which, you know, you can describe as lewd or lurid or whatever, they're perfectly legal, but probably inside Parliament House would be deemed inappropriate. Rather than addressing these directly, the Prime Minister and his team said, this proves that there's a problem with male culture in Australia and in the workplace at Parliament House. Therefore, we need more women. But hang on, I might be living in a very sheltered little world, Gideon, but I don't remember homosexual acts between consenting males as part of the broader male culture in Australia. So again, what has more women in Parliament got to do with this? Absolutely nothing. In fact, as Peter Credlin rightly pointed out, when Brittany Higgins raised the allegations initially, she did so. Every single person who handled those allegations, clearly in an unsatisfactory and incomplete manner, was a woman. There was all female MPs.
Yeah, the MP was a woman, the Chief of Staff was a woman.
Precisely. So how does having more women in Parliament fix the Brittany Higgins scandal? It does not. And finally, you go to the last one, which is the Nicole Flint one, which is the only one where there is, clearly a villain that is part of a culture, but that is a left-wing get-up, hardcore Greens, hardcore Labor policy of intimidation and victimisation and harassment of Liberal MPs. It's got nothing to do with having more women in Parliament. And in fact, the focus should really be on the Labor Party, for their way that they turned a blind eye to what happened to Nicole Flint. But more importantly, there are half a dozen accusations against Labor MPs within Parliament, getting up to various shenanigans at a time when the Labor Party have had a quota of women. So how does the quota for women, it didn't do anything for the genuine examples of what could be perceived as poor male culture within the Labor Party. Having more women didn't solve that. So on every front, quotas is not a solution for any of these problems. So why are we putting up a completely phony solution to a bunch of problems which the Prime Minister refuses to identify for what they really are?
Firstly, as we discussed, it's a little bit simplistic. But secondly, and I'm going to ask Kerry Wakefield about this later on in the show, but that press conference by Scott Morrison was extraordinary, not just because he, had a go at Andrew Colonel, which was absolutely bizarre in and of itself, but also, for all of Scott Morrison's foibles, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that he's mistreated a woman in his entire life. He's a devoted husband. He's got 2 daughters. He's a committed Christian. He has values, yet here he was crying and apologising and self-flagellating and taking on the mantle of the entire male sex. What is it about our culture that forces somebody who had nothing to do with any of this stuff other than, mishandling it politically? What is it about our culture that forces that on Scott Morrison? Exactly.
And this kind of cringing behaviour where he's saying, keeps referring back to his family, and I didn't realise there was this big problem with women, as you say, is nonsense. Scott Morrison there's nothing in Scott Morrison's parliamentary actions, time as leader, that suggests anything other than caring for women and being appreciative of women, as all Australian men are.
And we know from the trajectory of the Me Too movement since it broke out, 5 or 6 years ago, or whatever it was, that it actually ends up hurting women because it makes men who haven't done anything wrong actually extremely risk averse. There are anecdotally a lot of reports about men who will not have meetings alone with women, that will not travel with women on business trips. The hiring of women has dipped because of risk-averse workplaces. I mean, this battle of the sexes dynamic, yes, of course, we should not tolerate mistreatment, we should not tolerate harassment, we should not tolerate unwanted sexual attention, we should not tolerate discrimination, but this generalisation, and again, I make the point, this perennial battle of the sexes, it is not bringing us together, it is not helping women, it is just making us more and more divided. Well, thank you to you, Rowan, for speaking the truth. Thank you for your editorial this week. It is an absolute must-read. read, and looking forward to catching up again next week.
Thanks, Gideon. Take care, mate.
And remember, if you want to read more from our outstanding stable of talent at the Spectator Australia, just head on over to spectator.com.au. And if you like what you see, subscribe to the Spectator Australia today to get instant access to all of our outstanding content, including the weekly Spectator Australia magazine, all the articles in our online section, flat white, and great international authors like Douglas Murray, Brendan O'Neill, James Dillingpole, and many, many more. Just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Well, this week we saw terrible scenes as New South Wales suffered through a devastating flood. And right on cue, the usual suspects tried to capitalise on the disaster by saying that, like absolutely everything else, the flooding was yet more evidence of climate change. Now this, of course, comes a couple of years after global warming was blamed for Australia's terrible drought. So if it rains too much, climate change. If it doesn't rain enough, climate change. And anything in between, well, that's probably climate change as well. But the real problem is this: not only have climate lovies misdiagnosed the cause of natural disasters, they've actually prevented us from mitigating them. Green-inspired failures of land management have been well documented in relation to bushfires, and in the wake of the floods, well, we're reminded that plans to raise the Warragamba Dam by 14 metres were opposed by, among other groups, the United Nations on dubious environmental grounds. But one politician who hasn't been afraid to stand up to this globalist idiocy is our regular Spectator Australia contributor, Senator Matt Canavan. Let's see what he has to say. Senator Canavan, how are you?
I'm great, Gideon. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you so much for making the time up there in a busy sitting week to be here. Now, firstly, I think you have been vindicated this week on the Warragamba Dam. We've seen over the past few years the United Nations, among others, from thousands of kilometres away, stymie our infrastructure or argue against our infrastructure on the basis of dubious environmental concerns. What has this week shown us about what's at stake for not raising the Warragamba Dam?
It just takes so long. And as you say, you've had all these green groups latch on and say how terrible a dam is. Just imagine if we didn't have the dam. Let's just take it in principle here, putting aside the specifics of the raising of the wall. Imagine if the dam hadn't been there at all. Imagine the devastation across Sydney right now if we just didn't have what was there. And if you believe the Greens and the UN and all their allies, they don't want any dams anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of arguing the toss about a particular project. It's just they don't want them at all.
This plan was argued against even though the capacity of the Warragamba Dam was at 100%. I mean, how could nobody see this coming?
Well, people do see it coming, but there's just an agenda. There's a closed-mind agenda from Greens and their allies. We should start from a basic principle, really, that whatever the UN tells us to do, you should basically do the opposite. I mean, the UN does serve one useful purpose. It's a bit like the George Costanza principle, that if every instinct UN has is incorrect, the opposite of what they want to do must be correct.
The side effect of environmental regulation is stopping development. And you know what? I think that a lot of the time is the actual purpose behind it. Not to protect the endangered skink or God knows what else. It is to stop progress, stop development. It's this anti-human agenda, and we are all suffering for it.
Well, can I just make one more point too? It's Senate estimates this week, and as I was going through these issues with the Department of Environment, I did make the accusation to them. They didn't have much of a rebuttal. That their approach right now is systemically racist. Right? Their approach is, they are saying up in the Cape at the moment, they're denying and not approving a proposal to grow 2,000 hectares of sorghum in Cape York, because the problem for the people of the Cape, where a lot of Indigenous people live, is that their environment's quite good. They hasn't been developed that much. And so what happens is when you go to develop something under the EPBC Act, you've got to offset it with other things. Now, they can't offset it much because their environment, their local habitat is already in a pretty good condition.
It's pristine.
There's not any improvement they can make. So what they're saying is that for someone who wants to do 2,000 hectares of sorghum, they have to lock up 20,000 hectares of country. They have to lock up a lot more country because the country is pretty good to start with. And maybe I said to the Department of Environment officials, they do need to book in for some unconscious bias training, because it seems to me that the impact of their policies are racist. They are denying Indigenous Australians development. When you can go down to clapped out country in Central Plains, where I'm from, And you don't need to offset as much land because it's already been developed by white people.
And what happened then? Do they spit out their kombucha lattes, or how do they respond to accusations of systemic racism?
Kombucha latte, I don't know if that sounds very nice.
I don't think that's actually a thing.
I don't mind either of those things, I must say, but together I'm not so sure. But look, they didn't have much of a response.
But meanwhile, we are approaching $1 trillion debt. We have the world's highest power prices. As you said, huge parts of the country with enormous potential being held back by green tape. Employment is still sluggish. Wages are barely keeping up with inflation. Now, the scandals that are besetting the parliament are bad. But to me, the issues I've just outlined, which are the tip of the iceberg, are much worse. Do we have our priorities straight in the national debate?
The short answer is no, we don't. I do want to say the behaviour that's been exposed is absolutely unacceptable, but there has to be the re-establishment of standards and has to be a strong message to us all that this cannot continue. I do think we miss someone like Peter Credlin. I sort of started here working under her, and she was really good at doing that and impressing the importance of good behaviour, good standards. As I say, discipline. It's a privilege to work in this place, and that needs to be reflected in the way we go about our business. Now, but you're right. As important as those things are, there perhaps hasn't been a more challenging time for our country. Maybe I don't want to be too dramatic, but since World War II. But we really do need to quickly focus on the need to rebuild our industrial strength, get down our power prices so we're in a competitive position, continue to build up our defence and military capabilities, and I would say on the international agenda, focus on those things, not these distractions around how much emissions we're going to have in 2050. I mean, there's no point worrying about that if China invades Taiwan or some such, and we've got a completely different problem in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, and we're worried about pronouns and how many windmills we can build to offset the destruction we've done to our energy sector. You make a great point, and this point has been made by others, which is that you're right, Peter Credlin. I worked in the Abbott government as well, and I saw what Peter Credlin was like as chief of staff to Tony Abbott, and she ran a very tight ship. I mean, she would never have let this go on. One sniff of something like this, and she would have had forensic teams combing the desks a la CSI to see who the perpetrators were.
She would have had you for breakfast, right? You would have been, put the fear of God into us all.
Last week, you were in the news for suggesting that Australia may want to follow Europe's lead and temporarily rethink the AstraZeneca vaccine in light of blood clots and similar issues with it. Now, look, my view was always that the number of blood clot cases seemed to me to be statistically insignificant, and I wasn't personally concerned. But the reaction to people like you who for just posing these questions, saying, no, you can't say that, you can't bring it up, shut up and just keep getting the jab, that to me is self-defeating. That will not engender trust.
I'll tell you what, the reaction I've had from average people on the street and back home where I'm from in central Queensland, being full-throated support. The basic principle I've been trying to stick up for is that individuals should be able to have the choice of deciding on their own medical treatment. We've trashed a lot of freedoms in the past year, Gidgen, as you know, but I don't think we want the state telling people or making people take certain needles or medical treatment. That should be left to the individual. And this comes to my point about the pausing. I thought we missed an opportunity to pause because I get, that what the point you're making statistically, it seemed like, okay, there's not that many cases, but there are a lot of skeptical people out there about getting the vaccine. And if we had a pause, even if it was just for a few days while we waited for the European Medicines Authority to conclude its studies, that would have helped build confidence among the community, I'd say, because the regulators could then say, well, look, even if there's even a hint, even a scintilla of concern and safety, we will take the drastic action and pause the rollout. You can trust us. But look, that's gone now.
There's no capacity to shop around, to do your research, to look into things, to choose the vaccine that's right for you. You're right. It's this we're not even encouraged to do our own research. It's just we need to take our advice.
Well, doctors are gagged too. There's another point I forgot that I don't know if you've seen, but the regulatory authorities for doctors has issued statements effectively gagging GPs. They have been told in quite passive-aggressive language that if they do anything to undermine the vaccine rollout, they could lose their registration. And I've been inundated since I made my calls public, I've been inundated by correspondence from GPs raising this as a big concern for them. And none of these doctors are anti-vaccination. They just have the sort of concerns I've outlined here today and are unable to tell them publicly.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Canavan. Keep up the great work. Keep up the fight for freedom within the circus that is our national parliament. And when are you next writing something for the Spec?
Well, that's a good point. I was thinking of doing something on the vaccine issue, which you've just reminded me I'll have to do. So I have written something for my local paper, and I might be able to try and have a bit more fun in the Spectator. So I'll try and bash that into something soon. Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, thanks, Matt. Have a great rest of the sitting week. You too, Gideon. Have a good time, mate. Thanks. And now let's take a look at what you had to say in the YouTube comment section of last week's episode. Salty Dog 47 writes, if Malcolm Turnbull had half a brain, the other half would still be lonely. Also, can someone have a chat to ScoMo and the other left-leaning pseudo-libs on what proper liberal beliefs are? Well, Salty Dog, we're doing our best. Maybe politicians should turn off the ABC and watch Spectator Australia TV instead. It would be a lot more informative and a lot more useful to them, I'm sure. Eleni writes, my daughter turned 1 at the beginning of the lockdowns. She only spoke a few words at that time, and communication with her was largely through facial expressions. Makes sense, with a young kid. Now, she hated the mask and would try to tear it off my face. I can't imagine my child having to wear a mask. It is dehumanising. Well, you're right, Eleni, they are dehumanising, these masks. I hate not being able to see people's facial expressions. I hate being in a town full of people who are hiding their face. It's one thing to wear them, and I'm open to wearing them when there are actual, coronavirus cases out there. But to be forced to wear them when there aren't, absolutely bloody ridiculous. And finally, Paul writes, CounterCulture has become my favourite program of the week. I cannot miss it. The highlight for me this week, or last week's episode rather, was the interview with Alexandra Marshall. Her woke mathematics is spot on. I hate to admit it, but I was once a great fan of Malcolm Turnbull. Now he is just sad to watch. Well, look, thank you so much, Paul. We are so happy you're enjoying the show. And yes, we love Alexandra. She is such a brilliant writer of The Spectator. Maybe she should have her own show here on Spectator Australia TV as well. One for the suggestion box. And I'm also happy to say that I've never been a fan of Malcolm Turnbull. I always knew he was bad. As I said last week, I was the Hunter S. Thompson to his Richard Nixon, and I'm being proven right time and time again. Anyway, Paul, congratulations. You have won our weekly Best Comment Prize giveaway. Stay tuned for this book heading your way, Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, a stinging takedown of identity politics. And now, as always, let's take a look at this weekend's cover art with our brilliant covers editor, Sarah Dudley. Sarah, how are you?
Oh, very well, Gideon. Thank you. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Now, I loved your front cover this week, as I always do, but especially this one. It's like one of those brilliant Mark Knight cartoons or Johannes Leak cartoons. It fuses together two unrelated issues just so brilliantly and so perfectly. So talk us through what's on the front cover of this weekend's edition.
Well, the cover was inspired by a great article from Rebecca Weiser. On it, Scott Morrison is reacting to his week from absolute hell. The awful floods, the worst in decades, and then his starring role in the most catastrophic press conference, also in decades. He is in a whole ocean of pain as he tries to mansplain how he intends to deal with in-house sleaze and sexual violence. He's standing blubbering in a sea of tears, crying his eyes out. In fact, the deluge is so all-encompassing that the players in the psychodrama are all swept along in the raging torrent. It's a very diverse cast. A cabinet minister, prostitutes, homosexual prostitutes, an MP, an alleged rape victim, and numerous props from the scene of the crime. The headline is ScoMo in Floods, and it's superbly illustrated by Ben Davis.
Well, I'll tell you, Sarah, the cover was great, but your commentary about it was even better. Now, I love the tears motif. It to me just sums up, again, I've talked to Rowan about it, I'm talking to Kerry Wakefield about it, but I'm fascinated by this dynamic, the fact that ScoMo has to grovel for things that, he may have mishandled politically, but he had absolutely nothing to do with. Talk us, what do you make of that?
Well, you're so right, Gideon. ScoMo is making a huge mistake thinking being a champion virtue signaller is going to get him off the hook. If he was from the left, perhaps, but his grovelling sounds rather hollow to me. You could be excused for wondering if he's shedding crocodile tears. Consider MP Nicole Flint's treatment. She was massively disrespected by the left, with barely any support at all from her colleagues.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what self-flagellation does, Gideon. It shows ScoMo has actually lost the plot.
Yeah.
He's planning quotas for more women in Parliament. If they're all treated like Nicole Flint, quotas are actually irrelevant. They can't keep the women they've got. It's the lack of support that actually has to be addressed.
Well, Sarah, that's a brilliant point, actually. What happened to Nicole Flint had happened to a Labor MP. Not only would people actually give us stuff about it and report on it, but every Labor MP would be closing ranks and talking about nothing else. And in the Liberal Party, as we know, Nicole Flint got appallingly little support from her own people, and that to me is the real issue. Now, I love your pieces, as I've said, because there's always a little Easter egg detail in there, always something that somebody might not have picked up on. And I noticed the Sky News microphone, which is of course a reference to, as you said, one of the worst, a once in a 100-year press conference disaster, as we can call it. What did you make of Scott Morrison's extraordinary spray at Andrew Clennell?
That has got to be one of the most impressive own goals I've ever actually witnessed.
Shocking.
He made bizarre accusations about sexual misconduct in a toilet by a News Limited journalist that was completely and utterly untrue. If he'd hoped to deflect attention from the shenanigans in Parliament House, it was one of the most useless defensive moves of all time. Andrew Clennell looked suitably unimpressed, but at least he came through it with his dignity intact.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, look, thank you for coming on as always. Well done on another piece of art. You know, we should get into this NFT craze in the crypto world and actually start selling originals of these covers as a good little money spinner. But in the meantime, looking forward to next week's offering as always.
Thanks so much, Gideon. See you then.
And now let's see what else is making news within the media powerhouse that is the Spectator Australia. One of our very favourites, the great James Allen, annihilates the Morrison government in a searing look at how the Liberal Party has totally abandoned its base. As you know James Allen, he rarely misses. Make sure you read that one, you do not want to miss it. Judith Sloan watches the ABC, so you don't have to. Judith chronicles a week in which her TV was stuck on ABC News Breakfast. Now, this could be the best takedown of the ABC that I've ever read, and I read very widely in the genre. Make sure you have a read. Over at Flat White, the legendary David Leinhelm writes about the most loathsome, reprehensible people in Australia, the public health lobby. And this one I really enjoyed, a Spectator quick shot on the sickening extent to which private consultancy firms have profited from the government amid coronavirus hysteria. It is eye-watering and maddening what they have ripped off from the taxpayer during the coronavirus saga. So make sure that you get informed about that one. And of course, you can find links to all these stories and more in the show notes down below this video. So go and check them out at spectator.com.au. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for Morning Double Shot, a daily edition of Spectator Australia goodness brought to you by our editor, Terry Barnes. Now, Terry is up bright and early each and every morning, around the same time as I'm going to bed some nights, scanning the news and offering you your first shot of comment for the day and helping you make sense of whatever madness the morning news brings. Plus, your daily highlights of what the Spectator Australia is saying about the issues that matter. Morning Double Shot arrives at 7 AM each and every morning, so check it out, sign up, and be informed. Well, as I said at the top of the show, our politics is a mess. Our national debate has no substance anymore. It's all about posturing, grievance, conflict, virtue signalling. It's like some sort of showy, grotesque, hammed-up pay-per-view event from World Wrestling Entertainment. The storylines are compelling for a while, but the confected melodrama of it all, it gets a little old. It's certainly getting old for me, and I suspect it's getting old for you as well. And the last few weeks have seen a battle royale in Parliament House over the issue of women. Now, let me be clear, most, if not all, incidents that have been disgusting. They have been wrong. They are reprehensible, and in some cases they've been illegal. But unfortunately, commentary on the wider sociological implications of all this has been hijacked by opportunistic third-wave feminist types, and at times, the debate has become completely detached from reality. Just to give you an example, here's what one progressive opinion show had to say about the matter this week.
Man.
Cancelled.
Yeah, cancelled indeed. Anyway, in this weekend's edition of the Spectator Australia, Kerry Wakefield serves up a much-needed reality check. She joins me now. Kerry, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Gideon. Pleased to be here.
Well, we're very pleased to have you. Now, look, You know, this is obviously occurring within the context of the women's march that we've seen recently, and I don't dismiss the entire movement. Every woman I know has a story about a handsy boss or being followed late at night or some creepy bloke that won't leave her alone. I mean, let's have those discussions. But your piece, I think, is a much-needed reality check on the excesses of all of this. So where does the third wave contemporary feminist line of argument fall over for you?
Women have a lot more freedom and they go out and about. But with that freedom, I think, comes some responsibility as well. You cannot assume that you will always be safe and that you don't need to take any normal precautions just to keep yourself, you know, healthy, hearty and happy. You have to look out for things that might go wrong because things do always go wrong. You know,
I get the argument. I get that women should be able to walk wherever they want. They should be able to wear whatever they want and they should wear whatever they want. But as a bloke who can defend myself, you know, reasonably well, I hope, there are some parts in Melbourne that I wouldn't walk down, you know, at 3 a.m. And what gets me is that a lot of these discussions, when common sense stuff is seen as some sort of misogynistic attack.
I mean, of course, women always will be prey to criminals, to completely opportunistic sexual violence and attacks of all kinds. And they're the ones you can't do anything much about. But in as much as you do have agency, and women do, of course, have a lot of agency, I think women have enormous power and ability to control their surroundings and control the environment that they're in.
So, look, in your piece, you implied that the dangers women face aren't necessarily different from how they've always been, but, you know, a societal attitude is obviously different, but also there may have been a drop-off in I guess, parenting, for lack of a better term. I mean, is that the case here? Is that we're just not doing, as I said, a good enough job to teach our girls how to protect themselves?
I think it's become the norm in high school for parents to grant too much freedom to their children too early. There was a piece in the paper yesterday with a principal saying that parents have to learn to say no. That's entirely right. And I know parents feel that they can't be the most uncool parent on the block. They want to be friends to their kids, but that's not the job. The job is to keep your kids safe. And I think reading the Chanel Contos testimonials, those young women are having a torrid time of it. And I know they'll be the worst stories, but we shouldn't be exposing them. In a previous era, those young women would have been locked up and protected and not allowed anywhere near those sort of situations. Now, at that age, they're extremely naive. They've got no idea what's rolling through young men's heads. I was exposed very early on by chance. I overheard some 14 and 15-year-old boys when I was 13 talking about sex they'd had with girls, what it was like. It was extremely carnal and physical. I never really managed to, you know, escape the idea that men had, you know, from then on, no illusions about what young boys were thinking of. And it shouldn't be beyond our educators to instill those sort of messages into young women who otherwise have no way of knowing them.
Awareness is conflated with excuse, and I think that's a really messy and murky you know, area we're moving into with this.
Well, I'm not in any way seeking to excuse that. My fear is that young women don't understand that is what so many young men are like. Now, of course, there are many fabulous young men out there who aren't like that. But equally, there are very many young men who will, you know, they'll be thinking completely selfishly about it. So I think we've had a sort of collapse in parental control at a very vulnerable age. And these are the young women I really worry about, at least in the workplace and all the other discussions about, you know, Brittany Higgins, etc., and what's going on in Parliament House, which of course is to be condemned. At least you're dealing with adults there. You know, they're in their early 20s or whatever. It's a long way from 14, 15 and 16.
Further in the piece, you sort of touched briefly on the element of sexual repression, I suppose. Is that the great risk in all of this? Are we basically denying the human condition? Are we trying to will away biological reality?
Look, I think human sexuality is such a minefield that it has to be controlled and channeled. We want these young people to come out of their maturing years able to create good and loving relationships, family formation, all of that. You don't want them to come out bearing scars and damaged and hating the other sex and feeling put upon for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But Yeah, you see, there are so many nuances to this debate.
We saw this extraordinary press conference with Scott Morrison this week, yesterday at time of recording. Yes, he hasn't handled a lot of these issues very well on a political level. That goes without saying. But the way in which he engaged in the self-flagellation, he cried, he at one point lashed out at Andrew Clennell from Sky News and so on. I mean, Scott Morrison, for all his foibles, I don't think he would have ever mistreated a woman in his life. There's absolutely no evidence for that. And he's a devoted Christian. So why does Scott Morrison have to accept, I guess, the mantle of all the sins of the male sex like that?
No, I agree. I think it was a really unfortunate day, and I think he'd still be smarting about all of that. I think he conceded ground to the left. I think he tried to emote fest his way out of it. I don't think that was necessarily the right approach. Maybe he just should have come in and said, we've heard you, we've listened to you, these are the things we're going to do, and not try to be Mr., everybody's favourite uncle or whatever.
Thank you so much for coming on. Excellent piece. Had a great time reading it and looking forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks so much, Gideon. Enjoyed talking.
Now, I know you're watching CounterCulture because you value freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life. Now, if you want to stand up for freedom of speech, the power of the free market, an honest debate on climate change and the timeless values of Western civilisation, then you simply must join as a member of the Institute of Public Affairs. The IPA has been Australia's strongest voice for freedom for 78 years. Now, we don't receive a cent of funding from the government, and unlike most of the media, we are not beholden to nervous advertisers. We speak out only because of the support of thousands of Australians who are proud and great IPA members. And today I'm asking you to join them and become a member of the IPA community. Join the IPA today and you'll receive a signed copy of Rowan Dean's Corkscrewed, the brilliant novel written by Editor-in-Chief of the Spectator Australia, Rowan Dean. Now, this is an entirely fictitious account of a certain randy young Australian's adventures as a hard-drinking, fast-living, freedom-loving advertising executive in 1980s London. As it happened, I actually took this book with me on a flight to London, and I was laughing so hard that I disturbed the other passengers. Trust me, you will love this book. I loved it and you will too. And it comes free just for you as a viewer of CounterCulture when you become a member of the Institute of Public Affairs. Not only will you be supporting our work in defending freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life, but you'll also enjoy exclusive benefits like priority access and discounts to IPA events, our quarterly magazine, the IPA Review, our weekly email roundup for freedom enthusiasts, Hey, What Did I Miss? Regular updates from Executive Director John Roscombe offering his take on the tough issues of the week, policy updates from our gun research team giving you all the ammunition you need to own that lefty mate at your next insufferable dinner party, and some merch as well, of course. So just head to ipa.org.au/corkscrewed, sign up today and join Australia's voice for freedom. Well, one reason to support the IPA is because we are a voice for your fundamental legal rights. While other organisations line up to demand mob justice, we believe in the rule of law. As this show reported a couple of weeks ago, legislative analysis by the IPA shows that when it comes to fundamental legal rights like the right to silence and the privilege against self-incrimination, the current Liberal government has a worse track record than even Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard. In this weekend's edition of the Spectator Australia, the IPA's Morgan Begg writes extensively about this attack on our basic rights. Let's hear from him now. Well, Morgan Begg, welcome to Spectator Australia TV and CounterCulture. How are you?
Oh, great, Gideon. Thanks for having me.
That's good. Now, you're our resident legal rights scholar here at the Institute of Public Affairs. You have followed with great interest the Christian Porter matter, the important issues that it raises in relation to the rule of law and the presumption of innocence. Now, playing devil's advocate, the left will say, look, we're not doing away with the rule of law here. This isn't a criminal trial. This is just an independent inquiry that's outside the judicial system to determine whether, on a political level, he's a fit and proper person to be the Attorney General. What's wrong with that?
Well, an independent inquiry, that sounds like a great thing, completely unobjectionable, which is why they say it.
Yeah.
But in reality, an independent inquiry is a pseudonym, essentially, for a quasi-judicial process. Which kangaroo court, exactly, Star Chamber sort of arrangement, where they throw away legal rights, they drop the standards for making adverse findings, and these are usually, highly publicised, destroy careers, careers, ruin lives. And of course, and that's really why a politician would call for an independent inquiry, because they've got a political objective in essentially, scoring points. And, they want to win this political battle.
Yeah, they want to scalp.
Yeah, and they want to outsource it to something that they can claim is an objective and independent process.
The difference is this: so if you're accused of a crime, you have to convince a jury of your peers beyond reasonable doubt that you committed that crime. That is a high standard of proof. If there's a reasonable doubt in the mind of the jury that you did it, they can't convict. An independent inquiry would revert to the balance of probabilities, basically which one is more likely, 50-50. So that's the concern here, isn't it? That we are creating a parallel justice system for conservative politicians.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's be straight.
Yeah, well, that's right. The government has rightly rejected any call for an independent inquiry, but they still retain as a policy the proposal for a National Integrity Commission, which would establish independent inquiries into politicians, most likely conservative politicians, which would open the door to show trials and the destruction that what Labor want to see now with Christian Porter.
You wrote in your article in the Spectator Australia about foreign interference transparency scheme, which was introduced ostensibly to, the express purpose of it was to prevent countries like China from interfering in Australian domestic political life for various reasons. But it wasn't used that way. Tell us what happened with FITS.
This was late 2018 it came into force, and barely months later, this was being used to target conservatives in Australia. This was namely the organisers and speakers at the Conservative Political Action Conference, which was a hugely popular event, which was co-organised by Liberty Works, which is an Australian-based organisation, as well as the a conservative organisation in America. And that was the what was deemed a sufficient connection to harass the organisers and threaten them with jail if they didn't produce all this information.
Correct. And Tony Abbott as well.
That's right.
Was received shakedown letters from these
as a
people.
speaker at the event, he was given notice to produce information.
So you had bureaucrats from the Attorney General's Department engage in this under the absurd pretense that a few conservatives getting together to hear a few speakers in Sydney one weekend was some sort of nefarious interference in Australian domestic political life. I mean, how can they even maintain that facade?
So much power was conferred on department officials. This wasn't, there was no judicial oversight. This wasn't an official law enforcement operation or outfit that was exercising these powers, and they were given coercive powers to remove the right to silence and to sidestep the principles of natural justice and procedural fairness. And these were just given to department officials.
That's something the IPA has been doing a lot of research on, because more and more we are seeing these acts of parliament and these laws, the enforcement mechanism for which is a non-judicial avenue that, as you said, does away with core basic legal rights. So talk us through what that's looked like over the past 10 years or so.
This was our audit of federal legislation, which showed that it had just become an increasingly concerning trend that federal governments would introduce legislation which just overturned fundamental legal rights. So this was provisions which overturned the presumption of innocence, set aside principles of natural justice, the right to silence, and privilege against self-incrimination, which is pretty extraordinary, that you can be compelled to incriminate yourself.
I mean, this is a basic staple of the civilised world, the privilege against self-incrimination. I mean, what's the legal history behind something like that? That goes back, to the Magna Carta or something?
Oh, of course. This is like centuries of legal tradition, received legal tradition, and which modern governments are just completely failing to appreciate.
I hope that it's reversible. But look, to you, Morgan Begg, thank you for the work that you do, belling a cat on all these things. Not many people in the legal profession do.
Not enough.
In Australia. Well, not enough. In fact, a minority. So the work you do here at the IPA is so important. And keep writing for The Spectator.
Thank you, Gideon.
Well, that's it for this edition of CounterCulture right here on Spectator Australia TV. Leave a comment down below in the comments section and let us know what you think about dams, vaccines, toxic masculinity, or anything else we've talked about today. We'd love to hear what you think. We always do. And as always, we'll be giving out another special mystery prize to the best comments. So get those Spectator Australia creative juices flowing. And remember, to access all the content from the Spectator Australia, just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. And finally, remember to like this video, subscribe to the Spectator Australia TV channel if you haven't already. Keep sharing, keep liking, keep clicking, because every click of that mouse helps us beat big tech censorship and get our message out to more and more Australians. I'll see you next week, but in the meantime, have a great weekend, friends.